Hello, and welcome to Reaction Norm, your source for biology and culture and politics. I am joined this morning with Michael and Charles.
Hello. Hello, Patricia.
Hi, Michael. How are you this morning?
I'm good.
That's good. And Charles, how are you?
I'm doing great.
That's great. I'm also well. So today we've got a good episode lined up for you, I believe. We are going to, normally we like to talk about science and things that we've read, and we're still talking about science, but we're going to have a chance to maybe display a little bit more of our personality today and talk about some ideas that we find really interesting. So the background for this is that it seems like if you're a pop science writer or an anthropologist or an evolutionary psychologist, everyone has a theory of what made humans human. There's a slew of books out there, and every scientist seems to have their own little take on what it is that set humans on their own sort of evolutionary path to end up where we are, and what sets us apart from our common ancestors and apes and whatnot. So like I said, there's a lot of theories about sort of what made us humans in our current sense. And so we don't necessarily have a conclusion of what is the right answer. Probably, like everything, it's complicated and it's a little bit of all of these theories, but we do have our pet favorites. And so today we're going to talk about some of our favorite ideas of why humans are so smart, so different than apes, so just interesting. Does that sound okay, guys?
Sounds perfect.
Anything else you'd like to add before we get into our favorite, what makes us us?
I'd probably also say that like when I read these books, I mean, like we've had this conversation like offline before, and that it's like a lot of the books we read is like, oh, and this made us human, and this made us human, this made us human. And it's, I mean, to me, it seems kind of funny that it seems to be like a constant theme with like these pop science type books. Yeah, that's my comment.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with that.
I mean,
it seems like that's like it's sort of like the clickbaity thing that you can put it out there. Like, I've got the reason what, I've got it all figured out. This is why we're like that. Sorry, Michael, you were about to say something?
I wonder if we go, because there's always the problem of selection bias or recency bias, right? I wonder if we went back like 20 years, 40 years, would we find as much fixation on this question as we're finding now? Because I wonder if, because there's all this concern now around artificial intelligence and threats about the impact it's going to have on humanity, and questions about whether we're going to, engineer ourselves out of existence or something. There's been all these sort of speculations and related to, the singularity and large AI and, all this sort of stuff. And I wonder if there's a particularly keen appetite to address this question now, precisely because maybe at some level humans feel like, we're threatening our own existence with our technological development or something.
I was actually thinking of something else. Like one common theme you see in a lot of different like human cultures across space and across time is that it's common for humans to see them as being, it's common for humans to see other humans in general as being separate from other animals, right? So like, there's animals and there's human and they're separate. And there's characteristics about humans that can make them more animal-like, but there's a common belief that we're different, right? I was wondering if some of this kind of played into that. Like we're not animals, we're something else, and this is why.
So you're saying it's like a backlash against the idea that we're not actually that different from the rest of the animals? Is that what you're saying?
No. I think it's like confirmation bias in a sense that within a lot of human cultures, like, there's a belief that humans are different. And, nowadays, like people have this idea that we did come from animals. I don't think we like ever left, but there's a belief that we did come from animals. And this is the reason why now, right? And you see it's common in a lot of different cultures. It manifests in like lots of different ways. It's baked into like many languages, for example. It's baked into different religious and ritualistic practices.
The it you're referring to now is what exactly? You say it is baked in. What is the it?
Oh, the belief that humans are separate from animals.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
So
All right.
you could say that maybe this is like a little bit of like a narcissistic thing, that we're so interested in ourselves because we deem ourselves so special that we can't possibly be like anything else on Earth.
Yeah, maybe something like that.
Yeah, but I mean, that's an interesting question, right? I mean, do either of you dispute that we're obviously different? I mean, it doesn't mean that we're not animals and that we're not subject to the laws of nature like everything else to say that we're different from other animals, right?
Sure,
I mean,
sure, but
every animal is different from other animals.
Well, exactly. That's the thing.
Yeah. Like you could say like, oh, this is why kangaroos are different than all other animals. This is why penguins are different than all other animals. This is why amoeba are different, et cetera, et cetera.
But of course, I guess the reason why, I mean, the two reasons why we're more interesting is because it's us with the interest. That's one reason, and the other reason is because, I mean, like what other species can live, basically everywhere else on the planet in massive numbers and become, the dominant predator almost immediately everywhere it goes, right? I mean, it is kind of a weird thing, right?
What about ants?
I think we live more places than ants do. Are there ants in like in the North Pole and
I don't actually know.
In Antarctica? Or is there ants? I don't know.
Are there a lot of humans in Antarctica?
Well, there's some.
A few. There's like 80. I think there's like 80. We do have like a permanent research station, so there's a few.
Okay.
So now they need to be supplied obviously from elsewhere, right? But still, we can go anywhere, right? But I don't know. It's I mean, where in terms of maybe it's in terms of the big animals you can see, like ants are. We're too big to be concerned with ants.
Right? Okay.
And too smart. Too big and too smart, right?
Too big and too smart. Yeah.
All right. Well, should we? I think we're all going to take turns and sort of present our pet favorite idea in this, and I think Michael, you were going to go first.
Okay, so my pet theory, my favorite pet theory is my own, actually.
Disclosures.
Another opportunity for me to slog my book. Link below, folks. Not for the common good, evolution of human communication. But what I'm doing in that book is actually building off another idea, which I think is something that's worth mentioning in this context. It was first put forward by, as far as I know, by John Tooby and Irvin DeVore in an essay in the 80s, I believe, late 80s. It might have been 89. And I can't remember the name of the paper, but it's sort of come to be called or referred to, the idea has come to be referred to as the, I think the term they used was hominid entry into the cognitive niche. Now, in the last 10, 15 years, we've shifted the nomenclature. So what they meant by hominid back in the 80s, now we would now say hominin, right? Because now these terms have been changed, right? Hominid now refers to all the great apes, whereas hominin refers to Homo sapiens and our direct ancestors. So this idea of entry into the cognitive niche, it wasn't that they were making an argument necessarily for what caused the change in humans, but they were framing a way to think about what's different about humans or important about humans in terms of thinking how they're different. And this idea is to think that every species has a niche. It has some way in which it's specialized for some kind of art. And usually we think of this in terms of, a physical place, access to resources, how it fits in the food chain, relationship to predator and prey, and this kind of thing. But their idea was that cognition itself, solving problems, being really good at being able to solve problems, was a kind of niche that was available, and Homo sapiens took over that niche. Now, what led to that? Of course, there's all kinds of arguments around, I think, stuff you're going to talk about later, Patricia, the consumption of meat and so forth, cooking, and there's also the whole Richard Alexander thing about the importance of our sociality and how all this gave rise to it. But whatever the driving forces were, somehow we entered a new niche. Now, my take on this is that, and this would actually take, I won't go into this in too much depth because, I did write the book, link below, folks. And, but you need just a tiny bit of communications theory background to get a gist on this, right? So in semiotics, there's three standard kinds of signifiers. Signifiers, so like the physical manifestation of something that is sending a signal or mediating a signle from the signaler to the person, the receiver of the signal.
Can you give some examples just to make that clear for everyone watching?
Of which?
Of like signalers and semiotics and that stuff, just like some concrete examples, because it's going to be really abstract.
I was going to. I was actually going to.
Okay.
So let me see, where do I start? Okay, so like I said, there's three kinds of signifiers. Okay, and I'll just mention the first one because it's not really pertinent to the point I want to make, but it would be if you actually saw a picture of a dog, right? And it could be like a photograph, it could be a painting, it could be a sketch. You know, sometimes you can get those sort of like almost like line drawings that just sort of, you know, there's no detail, but it still sort of suggests the dog. I mean, any of those would be an iconic signifier because they're actually representing the actual dog. Okay. So that's not what I'm going to be talking about is iconic signifier, but that's an iconic signifier. So the ones that I want to focus on first are indexical signifiers. So an indexical signifier is something that's when I teach this, people always, they find the word indexical. Icon seems sort of like, okay, I've heard the word icon. I understand that it's a thing.
Like on a computer, right? Like an icon on a computer. It's like,
sure, that would be an example too, right?
Yeah.
So indexical kind of throws people off. So I always say to them, think of your index finger, and what do you do with your index finger? You point, right? And that's what indexical signifiers do. They point to something that isn't actually there. So if I was given the example of a dog as the picture of a dog as an iconic signifier, an indexical signifier might be like a dog house or a dog's food bowl, right? Like there's no dog in the picture, but if you recognize these things as being associated to dog, then you're going to be thinking of a dog, right? So indexical signifier is kind of invoking an absent state or an absent something that is not really there, but it becomes sort of relevant to the context of the situation. So
is it like saying like he or she or they? Those would be indexical signifiers?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's let me go on and give the third kind, and maybe that will help. Okay, so the third kind of signifier are symbolic signifiers, and there's debate around this. Some will say that these are strictly used by humans. So I think you can find examples in the animal world where maybe symbolic signifiers exist. I can give some examples of that in a minute if you want. But symbolic signifiers are signifiers that have no natural relationship to the thing that's being signified, the thing that's being referred to, right? So squiggly lines, you put a bunch of squiggly lines and they, hold on. Let me give you an example of squiggly lines. Hold on. Here we go. Visual aids, folks. This is don't you love this show? All right. Okay. Squiggly lines, you see, right? These are just squiggly lines, right? They don't refer to anything, right? But if you know the code, you know that it's referring to this thing called a dog, right? And of course, you know that there's got no inherent meaning because I could write, I could write those squiggly lines. That's what they use in Spanish to say the same thing, right? So it's completely arbitrary. And of course, the same thing, even as I'm speaking, I'm using phonics, right? The certain phonemes or whatever, that go together. And you guys, everyone's listening to this who speaks English recognizes the construction of that is the word dog, and they know that that the animal that refers to, right?
Okay, so let me just like see if I can like clarify this and see if it makes sense.
Sure.
So when you write the word dog using DOG, that's what would you call that one again?
Symbolic signifier.
Symbolic signifier. If you were to draw a picture of a dog, that would be an iconic signifier,
yes,
right?
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And what would be an indexical signifier? Like, could you draw that, or that'd be like no?
Well, my drawing skills aren't so great, but like I said, like if I showed you a picture of a dog house,
yeah.
If it invoked a dog for you, it'd be functioning as an indexical signifier of a dog. It would be signaling dog indirectly without actually using a dog.
Why isn't the writing of DOG like a indexical?
Because it's just a code. Like anyone, if you don't speak English or you don't speak any language at all, but if you've been around and you've seen that dogs live in dog houses, then seeing the dog house can serve to invoke a dog. This won't necessarily, but it can serve to invoke a dog for you, right? But you have to learn the secret code of the squiggly lines to be able to make sense out of this set of squiggly lines is signaling a dog.
Okay.
But so, it is similar. There's a similar. You seem to be hitting on the idea that there's a similarity between the two, and there is a similarity between the two, and that's kind of what's important here. But let me give some examples first from sort of the animal world.
Hang on, example. So if you're walking in the forest, and you see some dog poop, is that an indexal signifier for a dog?
Yep.
Okay,
if you're confident that it's dog poop rather than say reindeer poop or something, bear poop or something.
Or so like a dog print in the ground, right?
Yes,
like
absolutely. Indexical signifier, absolutely.
So we're just talking about ways of abstracting, right?
Well, this is the thing. Okay, I mean, definitely symbolic signifiers are ways of abstracting, right? And that's kind of the important point, right? Indexical signifiers. I mean, it depends what you mean. It seems to be wired into animals to use indexical signifiers. So let me give you some examples. Okay, so dogs, right? So the dog, you're getting too close to a dog. Let's say the mother dog is, has got her pups here behind the corner, and some stranger's coming. She starts growling in her teeth, right? So that is an indexical signifier, right? Because it's not nothing's. I mean, the growling, it doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't hurt you. It doesn't, it's like, it's the threat. It's the state that's being invoked. In the same way as the dog bowl invokes the dog's growl and bark and bark evokes attack, injury, being bitten, right? So it's evoking another state, right? A state that isn't actually present, but could be present, right? So this is kind of what the indexical signifier does. Think of birds, think of like cardinals. Right. So among cardinals, the male brings food, engages in a mating ritual that involves bringing food to females to try and get them to mate with him. Right. And she usually will choose the mate who's the best provider. That's kind of an indexical signifier because we believe she's choosing that mate because the belief is that once they mate and she's sitting on the eggs, then he'll be a good provider, bringing food to her and to the chicks once they're born. So again, it's kind of evoking a state that doesn't actually exist, but could exist, right? And is promised by the nature of the signal. Another would be some animals will like males particularly will mark out their territories, will pee on trees and stuff. You mark out their territory, telling others of their species, don't, if you cross this line, you're going to be in for a fight because I've marked out this territory, sort of thing.
Have you ever tried doing that?
Marked out my territory?
Yeah.
Peeing on tree? I don't know. Yeah. Not for that purpose. No.
Okay.
I'm not that kind of animal who does that sort of thing. Okay. What else? There's lots and lots of these examples, but I mean, the point is that virtually all, there are some interesting cases of animals using iconic signifiers. There are such things. And there's some cases where you can argue about whether animals might use symbolic signifiers, but certainly indexical signifiers are everywhere in the animal world. Everywhere you look, the vast majority of animal communication is something that's done to try and affect the behavior of another organism of either their species or a different species to try and get them to do something that's in the interest of the one who's setting the signal. They're doing that by trying to create some new kind of state, trying to get someone who wouldn't mate with them to consider mating with them, to kind of get someone that would have been rivalrous for them over resources to not challenge them, or to not try to eat them, or to avoid them, or to there's all kinds of different relationships that can arise, but the vast majority of them are in some way indexical signifiers. That seems to be the norm in animal communication. So. Now, working my way all the way right back to the main point.
What was the main point again?
As Bill Cosby would say, I told you that story, so I could tell you this one. So you're not supposed to cite Bill Cosby anymore, right? That's right. But I grew up in Bill Cosby, so I actually still like him, even though he may not be a nice person. But anyways, my argument here is that symbolic signifier, and I think Charles was sort of getting towards this, the symbolic signifiers are doing the same thing that indexical signifiers are doing, right? They're using something that's present that is not the thing that's being referred to, but evoking a state that is absent. So my idea is that I think that somehow along the way, our ancestors recognized the internal dynamic of indexical signifiers in all the communication processes that they noted in the animal world around them. And somewhere they actually, and you brought up the word, Patricia, abstraction. This is where abstraction comes in. They developed the ability to be able to abstract those relationships and manipulate them in intentional ways. And this is how you get, so symbolic signifiers are ways to try and get the same relationship, invoking something that is absent to be able to communicate in the present and be able to manipulate the present towards that end. And once you have that capacity, then all kinds of other things that we sort of take, well, not we take for granted, but we recognize as being part of what's fairly uniquely human, as becomes possible. Because you think of things like theory of mind, right? Theory of mind is speculation about what's going on in the mind of someone else. You can't actually know what's inside the mind of someone else. But if you have this idea that through observation or manipulation or thinking about what's present and the cues that it's giving, that you can sort of conjecture about another state that isn't actually in evidence to you, then you can speculate about someone else's mind. Same kind of thing. Another thing that's fairly thought to be fairly distinctive to humans is a sort of long-term, I have a story for this actually, of the sort of long-term ability for strategic modeling, that we can think far into the future and think about potential consequences in a way that other species don't seem to be able to do. A couple of interesting stories. Do you want me to tell my stories first? Do you want to ask your question first?
I feel like I just want to try and get like a brief synopsis to make sure that I'm understanding the argument. So it is sort of like in like one sentence. So we understand the signifiers and stuff. It was once humans were able to start abstracting to communicate with each other, or like
I think that okay. So what I'm saying is that I think a key part, and I'm not saying it's the most important part. I'm not saying it's the driver. Sure. It might be a symptom. I don't know, right? But a key part of what we call the hominin entry into the cognitive niche was humans recognizing the built-in dynamics within indexical signifiers, which are the normal form of communication across the animal world, and they figured out how to intentionally manipulate it towards their own ends.
And the cognitive niche would be? The
cognitive is precisely taking over this space in which intelligence becomes its a fitness benefit that sort of trumps all others and ends up becoming the most powerful. I mean, so I'm trying to not go into too much of the streams that this follows off of, but one of them that's worth taking into account is that throughout the sort of natural history, changes. If you think in terms of arms races, right? We talk about evolution in terms of arms races. Arms races have always taken place at an evolutionary timescale, very long periods over multiple generations, where new mutations would come that would provide benefits that would allow the development of something to allow you to compete better with another lineage, right? Either a lineage of your own species or a predator-prey lineage, right? That's always the way it's been. Humans have now developed the ability to make these surprise attacks on other species. Like we can defenses that had previously taken hundreds of thousands and millions of years for other species to develop, we can now undermine in an afternoon, right? We're not playing on the same playing field as them anymore. Like, for instance, take the case of the Hazda people who live in Africa, and they actually have this strange relationship with what do they call them, honey-guide birds. But anyways, the honey-guide birds lead them to the beehives. But anyways, that's another weird story. But anyways, what they do is they recognized that if you start a fire and make a very smoky fire, that the smoke confuses the bees and disorients them long enough for them to take down the hive and get the honey out, right? So this evolved ability over, I don't know, billions of years for bees to swarm, attack, and sting to defend their hive, because humans could have figured out this in an afternoon. Like, some human could have been sitting around and then saw a fire and saw that, that the smoke was affecting the bees, and sort of thought, hey, look at that. The bees are confused. We could probably get the honey out of the hive without getting stung, right? So, I mean, like, it's humans are now operating at a different level of strategy in the arms races between other species, which is why, we're sort of like a joke, individually, on some level, right? I mean, the old joke is that, if you drop a naked human alone into the wilderness, you've just given some other animal its dinner, right? But you drop 100 naked humans, into the wilderness, you just introduced a new dominant predator into that region, right? And part of this is because of our ability to communicate, our intelligence, the way in which we work out these kind of problems. And we just now are at a place. This is why we're the dominant species. We can't run fast. We're not very strong. We don't swim very well. We've got none of the things that would suggest we should be able to survive, and yet we're the dominant species all over the planet. And the reason for this probably is that we're simply, because of entering into the cognitive niche, we now simply can disarm every other species' defenses in the arm races that they developed over eons, hundreds, thousands or tens of thousands of generations. And for us, it's very simple, because we can engage in this sort of strategic modeling. So this is not exactly the point I was making, but this is part of the implication of the hominid entry into the cognitive niche. Well, I was trying to respond to Patricia's point there. So did I respond to it adequately?
I think so. It's just a lot I feel like it's a lot to take in. So I'm just trying to make sure that we've got like a couple nice summary points of your argument.
Right. You know what the great thing though is, Patricia?
What?
Is that the link down below? There's a book that people can read.
Right. No, and it's a fabulous book. I've read it. It's really good.
You guys have both read it. You guys have both read it. So I'm not trying to sell you. I'm trying to sell the people watching.
Right. Just want to make sure that it's a little bit of jargon, right? Like cognitive niche. That's these are probably maybe terms that, in case some of our viewers aren't familiar with them. So I just want to make sure that we're sort of laying it all out well. Right. But I think Charles, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
Well, let me actually.
Sorry.
I had a couple of examples I wanted to give of the importance of this kind of thing, right?
Okay.
So two things. One example is that it turns out. So one thing we know is that one of the things that is often associated with this is human abilities to make tools, right? Now, of course, we know other animals make tools, right? But here's the interesting thing: like chimpanzees will go to all this work, like they have this, they'll get these they'll tear a branch off a bush, and they'll have to strip all the leaves off and smooth it all off. And it's a fair bit of work, right? And so that they can finally dip it into like a termite's nest and pull that out and eat the termites, right? Sort of thing, right? So they do all this, right? And then they just throw away the tool, right? And so it turns out that prior to Homo erectus, our ancestors did the same thing. And I don't know exactly how to do this. I guess they get some kind of a profile from the mineral composition of the tools, but we know that prior to Homo erectus, that our ancestors used to, build these tools, go all the work to, carve these stones to look like tools, axes or whatever, or knives, right? They'd use them, and then as they would migrate to somewhere else, they just left the tools behind, right? It was only Homo erectus that starts actually carrying its tools. It does the work to create the tools, and then it keeps the tools, right? And so our ancestors had to get to a certain level of cognitive development to think, I'm doing all this work to build this tool. I'm just going to have to do it again a week from now. Maybe I should just keep the tool, right?
That's an assumption that it was somehow like a conscious decision rather than maybe the person became.
First of all, I notice I've never used the word conscious. I would never use the word conscious here, right? But okay. I think your point is intentional is more a point than conscious.
Yeah, intentional. Right? I mean, it could be just like personalities changed a bit. Maybe you started getting the first pack rats and they just start keeping everything, including the tools, and then
Yeah, that's possible. Of course, it's also possible that you're right. You're right. It's an assumption, but I think it's a reasonable assumption. It's not an unreasonable assumption. Another example is that this one's kind of gruesome. So if there's kids listening, you might want to turn this off. Anyone? Jane Goodall tells a story about observing chimpanzees, and there was this mother and daughter team in this one troop who would cannibalize the newborn infants of the other mothers. They would actually attack them and take away the children and eat them. And a couple, which is gruesome enough. But the interesting thing about it is that the two things, I guess, were related. In one case, the first time she had observed this, the mother tried desperately to save the child. But once the child was dead, the mother of the murdered child immediately engaged in an activity of basically reconciling with the cannibalistic mother while the cannibalistic mother was still eating her baby, still literally eating her baby, and she was already in a process of reconciling with her. And another interesting part of the same story is that there was one mother who lost 3 babies in a row, 3 different babies she had. This mother-daughter team came, took her baby, and killed it and ate it. Right, 3 separate times. So the point I'm drawing from all this is that you could never do that to a human, right? If you did that once to a human, they would say, next time you come, I'm going to be ready for you, right? You're doing this all the time. And of course, we know from, reading what's his name's book, Christopher Baum's book, Hierarchy in the Forest, that there's good reason to believe that human society is largely a function, as we know it, is largely a function of the way in which we organize ourselves in our ancestral past to put down tyrants, to put down alpha tyrants, right? People who are abusing people in the group. We had all kinds of strategies for dealing with them, but chimps don't seem to have these kind of strategies for long-term thinking. And again, I think it's because humans have have learned how to manipulate the relationship indexical signifiers to think symbolically, to think abstractly, allowing to plan for the future, in which the reason why you can't do to humans what can be done to these chimp mothers by these psychopathic cannibal mother-daughter team. Because they don't seem to have the capacity to be able to plan long-term into the future. That seems to me an important part of what distinguishes humans from other animals. This is why we have, all this stuff, including the internet that we have on. You have to be able to do a lot of long-term planning to eventually come up with the internet, beginning with smoke signals or whatever, right? Going back to the beginning of communication.
So I'd like you to clarify something a bit more. What do you mean by, because I have an idea what I think I would mean by, but what do you mean by abstract thinking?
Oh, being able to take something that is naturally in one context and imagine it in another context. That's what I mean by that. Or I don't know if I would say that's a definition of abstract thinking, but to me, that's sort of like the minimum condition to be able to think abstractly.
Okay, so would it be like what someone might call like an imagination? Like,
yes,
I know this person, and I can imagine, we're both like. Let's use the example of mating. Like, oh, there's this attractive like wildebeest, and ooh, I'm a male wildebeest, and like I can imagine us, frolicking off in, I don't know, the the tundra, going down to the water, and doing the thing.
The difference is that, I mean, all animals, I think, if they're seen, if they observe the opposite sex of their species that has, signals of good mating potential, then they respond to that in some ways, in some program that is part of their evolved nervous system, right? What is different in humans is that, I can do the standard things that any human is going to do to try and get the attention of a potential mate, but I can think into the future to come up with unusual and original strategies that other people don't use. And it's interesting that, and I guess I think you're going to talk about Jeffrey Miller, right? So, I mean, one of the arguments there is that, part of what women select in men is for, intelligence and originality and creativity, among other sort of factors, right? And that would sort of tie nicely into this idea that what's distinctive is for human mating is that we're not just reacting strictly at the level of a program, but we seem to be able to engage in this process. And I think the right word is imagination for it. If you take all the different kinds of things, strategic planning and theory of mind, and all the different applications that you might have for the roles of symbolic signifiers, all of them probably could be put together under the umbrella of imagination, the ability to be able to imagine a future that doesn't exist.
Okay, so I don't expect you to probably be able to answer this, but like one question I would have is that what evidence is there that other animals don't have this ability to imagine stuff? I mean, hang on.
I just gave you the case of the chimpanzees.
Just give me a sec. So I mean, like with humans, us being the researcher being a human, they'll say, well, I know humans can have an imagination. because I can just tell because I have one, right? And I always wonder, like, the standards that people apply to animals, right, to test for something like theory of mind or, intelligence or, some emotion, like, do they apply that to humans also, right?
Well, I mean, look at the, is that your question?
Well, my question is like, how do you know, like, other animals don't have this ability to imagine stuff?
Well, I mean, I don't know. I think imagine is, like I said, I think imagine is a nice category, a nice umbrella category for all these different things, right? But I think that if you want to test them, you have to break them down into individual applications, right? So I mean, and some are probably easier to test than others. But as you probably know, there's been a lot of effort, say, to test for theory of mind in other animals, right? And whether or not animals have theory of mind depends very much on how you interpret theory of mind, right? So but it was there were experiments with primates, particularly of chimpanzees, I guess in the 90s, that claimed to prove that they had theory of mind. But then a younger generation of scholars, or I guess a newer generation of scholars in the 21st century, have gone back and re-looked at a lot of this. People like Penn and Povinelli, I think are their names, have gone back and re-looked at the findings from these studies, and it began to point out that these things were not actually theory of mind, because if they were theory of mind, you would have gotten different outcomes than you did. Like, I think we've talked in the past about this experiment where they did with the chimpanzees, where they had a researcher inside the room and a researcher outside the room. And the researcher inside the room would hide some grapes or something that the chimpanzee would want, and then the researcher outside would come in, and they both would point to a box. There were 3 boxes, and they were hidden from view of the chimpanzee, and then they removed the barrier, and each of them would point to one of the boxes. And so a human child, as of like 4 years old, once theory of mind kicks in, knows immediately that only the person who was in the room and put the grapes in the box knows which box it is, but the chimpanzees didn't know that. But what they did eventually was they figured it out, right? So they figured out the sort of physical relationships of cause and effect, right? So eventually they figured out. But if you look at the pattern of outcomes for the chimpanzees, you see that they're just doing random at the beginning, and then later towards the end they get good because they figure out cause and effect relationship. But that's not theory of mind. A human child, a 4-year-old human child, would know from the very beginning, and they were tested too, right? And they know from the very beginning, because they have theory of mind, they know that the outside guy can't know where the grapes are, right? So this I think that I mean, I didn't come prepared to really go through all the evidence, and it's a good question, but that would be one example. And I think I think that the tendency is actually in the opposite direction, Charles. I think the tendency is to engage in anthropomorphism, to assume that other animals have the capacity that humans do. And and a lot of bad research has been done based on that assumption without being rigorous enough. And I think we're entering a new phase where this kind of research is being more demanding. It's turning out the animals really don't have the capacities that were attributed to them back in the 20th century.
Yeah, but I mean, like, you can take a different approach, like different approaches to this, right? Like, one of them is to assume that humans have whatever abilities we think, or other animals have whatever abilities we think humans have, right? Yet another approach is to assume that they have none of the abilities that we attribute to humans, right?
Yeah, you can assume that, but that actually isn't the record of the research, though. The record is the other way around.
You could also take the assumption that we don't know which one, and let's just look at this model where we assume they have it, this model where they assume they don't have it, and we can just bring in evidence, and as the evidence comes in, we can see which model, which theory seems to be more supported by the evidence, right? Like that's another approach.
But that's exactly what we've been doing, though, right? The point is,
a lot of the researchers I see don't seem to take that approach. I won't get into the technicals of it, but they use a very classical technique, which I have technical debates over, but it doesn't matter.
But I mean, unless we're going to get into that might be an interesting discussion, but I feel like we could probably agree that that's not really the scope of today's show. Too far into that.
The moderator intervenes. Right.
Okay.
Very good.
So Michael's theory for why humans are different is that we have an imagination, basically, right?
No, I wouldn't put it that way. I would say that we have the ability to abstractly manipulate symbols and what grows out of that. You could describe that under the umbrella of imagination, but I would say the ability to abstractly manipulate symbols is really what distinguishes us.
What's a symbol? Give me an example of a symbol.
Oh, we just went through all this, Charles.
This.
Okay. What about human cultures that don't have a written language? Do they not have that ability?
Of course they do. I said that. Are you not paying attention to what I'm saying?
No,
I said I'm using phenoms right now here, and these are symbols because a person who didn't speak English would not be able to make any sense out of it. You have to know the code, right? That's the key thing of symbols, right? You have to know the code.
So language could be an example of a symbol.
Of course,
I'm just trying to think. Like, are there any example like that in the animal kingdom?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be written. It's more.
This is huge, right? Whether animals have language, right? This is a big controversial issue, right?
I've seen some evidence that suggests that they do. The question then would be: is it like a single language that's baked in, or is it something they pick up? I think for what you're talking about, there'd have to be different languages and something they kind of like absorb and develop like as they're like getting older, like maybe similar to the way humans do.
Something like that. Yeah. But I think probably Patricia's right. We probably should move on.
Maybe we should have just done the whole show on Michael.
Can I just say one more thing though? I just want to get this in because I wouldn't want to forget to say this to everyone. Link below.
Right.
Oh, did I already say that? Okay.
Yeah.
Right. No, maybe we should do another episode on some of these ideas, Michael, because I feel like there's a lot there that we could really dive into, and a lot of it it's sort of fairly unfamiliar. Like, I didn't do anything in communication studies, so that's all sort of like new territory for me. Next theory, I guess we'll keep moving on. Charles, do you want to do yours, or should I?
You do yours.
Okay, do mine. All right. My pet theory is Richard Wrangham's book Catching Fire. Also, it does have the same name as that, like, I think it was Twilight, Hunger Games. There was some like young adult fiction book that has the same name, which makes it a pain for finding on Amazon. But no, Richard Wrangham is a British scientist, and his thesis, Catching Fire, is that humans were able to become smart and intelligent in many of the ways that sort of Michael just discussed when they figured out cooking. So once they figured out fire and cooking, they were able to take part of digestion outside the body, and that let our guts become much smaller. And so it freed up the resources in our body for our brains to become much bigger, and that let us be smart, but that this was sort of the catalyst for that change. And there's a number of different bits to the, so I'm just trying to think about what the next thing. So let's say you're the average chimpanzee. You spend almost your entire day eating. Your gut is huge because it really just, if you're eating plants,
it just takes a long time to chew it, for example, right?
It takes a long time to chew it, a long time to for your body to break down to get the nutrition out of it that you need to. So you have to spend a lot of time just literally finding, eating. That's like your entire day, right? Whereas when you're able to cook something, it allows you to access more of the nutrients and calories in it. And so there's a few
There was a nice quote from the book that cooking is a technology to start the digestion process outside the human body. So like cooking is, you're already starting to digest it, and then you stick it in your body. You don't have to do much of it like left, right? So it allows you to get a lot of those nutrients in a short period of time rather than spending like most of your day finding food, chewing it, digesting, etc.
Right, exactly.
You do know, Charles, you do know that Patricia already said that.
Okay, you can say it again.
You're on a bit of a run.
Yeah.
It's okay.
I was just saying it better. That's all.
It's a great summary. And so there's been other theories that have been, I think, less well supported that have talked about how meat, they kind of take the same theory and they're like, oh no, it was when we became carnivores and meat is what allowed us to get, some of the calories we need and whatnot. And Wrangham, I think he agrees that meat might have been an important part of the diet, but I don't think that he thinks that that's the be all and end all of it. I think that there's a lot of societies that ate mostly plant-based and seem to do so really healthy, and are flourishing. So the idea that it was meat that was the sort of like the switch that flipped, that helped us get where we are, he would disagree with. He would say that it was actually the cooking, and that cooking not only, like we said, takes digestion out of the body, but it helps reduce spoilage. It's a source of heat. One aspect of sort of his theory talks about that this would have been around the time when proto-humans, I guess, not proto-humans, what would you call it? I think this was around where Homo erectus came down from the trees. And so that it became part of it made it more safe to live on the ground because you had sort of fire as a protection, and made us more social because we would gather around the hearth to cook things. So there's a lot of aspects to it. And one other point that I just wanted to make while we're talking about it is there's very little evidence that humans do well on raw food diets anymore. It seems almost impossible for humans to eat healthily and flourish when you're only eating raw food. People tend to lose a lot of weight. They have, I think 50% of women who are eating an exclusively raw food diet, stop menstruating. So this idea that human populations could flourish with just raw food, I think that there's just no evidence to support this. And so our digestive system now reflects it reflects the fact that we have to eat cooked food. If that makes sense. Do you guys have anything?
So I'm just, do we know? So I mean, when because I should preface this by saying that this is a book we read in our book club, but I unfortunately had to take a sabbatical from the book club at that point. So I actually haven't read the book, though. I've heard the argument and everything, right? But so when he wrote this, he was taking his view on diminishing the importance of the meat diet was an anti-consensus view, right? I think so. Yes. Yeah, I think that the people, and I think that's still the importance of meat is still the consensus view, I think, right? Or has he changed? I don't know if we know has he shift the consensus on this? Do we know that at all?
I don't know. I'm not sure.
No.
Yeah. I think my feeling was that he didn't think it was well supported, but
right. So I mean, this is interesting, Patricia, because does he address, because it seems like everything as I understood the argument as he's put it is sort of explaining the conditions for, like, if I want to explain, if I'm looking in terms of entering the cognitive niche, bigger brain, all this sort of stuff, right? I think that the thinking is that once, whether it's meat eating or cooking or a combination of both or one or the other, whatever it is, something allowed us to not need as large an intestine. And the idea is sort of like the limited nutritional budget that we all have is every individual species and organism has could be through evolutionary time could be shifted away from the production of the larger intestine towards producing a larger brain, right? So it's like the argument he's making is an argument that explains the conditions for what I was talking about, the hominid entering the cognitive niche. What he's talking about are the conditions that allowed for the entry of the hominid into the cognitive niche. And I'm just wondering, is there anything in the book that suggests the evolutionary pressures that would actually cause it to be directed in that direction? So this new opportunity was available, this new opening in nutritional budget became available. Is there anything that suggested about cooking or fire that explains it as an evolutionary pressure towards where that budget was used in terms of increased cognition and brain size and all that stuff?
No, I don't believe so. I think that he mostly talked about decreases in like the shape of our jaw, our teeth. He talked about sort of more how evolution had like culled things that were now redundant.
Okay,
but I think that there was that the brain is such a like big, costly organ. I think my understanding was his argument was that you just couldn't have supported it.
Yeah.
On like a diet that.
Yeah. Which seems pretty much right, I think.
Right.
And fifth, and I like it because it dovetails nicely with my theory too.
It does. And I like it because cooking is one of my favorite hobbies. So I can take all the credit for, human success by, carrying the flame, literally and figuratively. Sorry. I couldn't resist. I couldn't resist. Okay. Anyway, so that's my favorite little story. I think that it makes a lot of sense. Wrangham his book's really readable, so I'd highly recommend it. And he also to me, a lot of people, when we've read a lot of these books, they kind of said like, oh, I've got the answer for everything, but he's a little bit more tempered. He seems to be, really like goes through his arguments quite thoroughly and whatnot. So I just thought it was a really good piece of it's quite short too. I'd almost call it an essay rather than a book. I think it's only like 200.
You read it, right, Charles? You were involved in reading it, right?
Yeah, I read it. It was a great book.
Yeah, that's all you have to say.
Well, Trish said a lot of stuff. I can go over.
She covered it. She covered it. Okay.
I hope I covered it all right. It's a good argument. So okay. I enjoyed it. All right, Charles, over to you.
Okay.
What is your favorite pet theory?
Well, it's I don't know if it's favorite. I picked one, and I guess I picked it because I can also talk about one of my own theories.
Gee, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. So I mean, it was a long time since I read this. So I think all three of us with some up. Do you guys hear the sirens? There's like sirens. I don't know if you hear that.
I think it's my neighborhood. Sorry, I live in a miserable neighborhood.
Yeah. Okay. So all three of us, I think, read Jeffrey Miller's book, The Mating Minds, a number of years ago. And it was a good book. And one thing, and I hope I'm not misremembering this, and if he ever watches this, he might complain because I misremembered it. But one thing
you can come on the show and set us straight.
That's good. Yeah. To do that.
One thing I think I remember in the book is that he suggested one of the things that made humans a bit different was there was runaway sexual selection, right? And okay, well, what does that mean, right? Like often. A lot of specialists in the fields of like biology and behavioral sciences and whatnot will talk about selection. Well, what the hell does selection mean? Well, some people might conflate it with like, survival of the fittest, right? It's think of like if you're a farmer maybe, and this is like not natural selection, but like you would call artificial selection. If you're a farmer and you have a bunch of plants and maybe you want like bigger fruit, right? So you'd find like the plants with the biggest fruit and you'd get them to mate among each other and they produce like children with big fruits. And, over the generations, you can make it bigger and bigger. And you might do that with animals too. Like maybe you have chickens and they only lay eggs once a month, but some of them lay it, a little shorter. Well, you take the ones that, they lay their eggs sooner and you get them to mate among each other. Obviously not females with females, but the male children with female children. And then you can slowly get chickens that lay eggs, shorter and shorter periods of time. But in the wild, there's things that get selected for too, right? And it might be different things. It could be that maybe males with big, scary horns, sharp, pointy horns get selected for. Maybe it's resistant to certain disease. Maybe it's having a longer neck so you can reach, fruits and leaves high up in the tree or whatever, right? And one thing you find is a lot of times when you have this kind of selection for survival, for example, for having the long neck that reaches the top of the trees or like having big fangs to kill the prey, a lot of animals get, these features, right? Like claws will come up in like lots of animals that didn't necessarily have it. Eyes you have in lots of different animals, although I know there's debate over like whether it's from a single source or multiple sources. You'll get like tentacle-like things, like whether it's an elephant's trunk or an octopus's arm or whatever. But these kind of like characteristics just get re-evolved. But there's another type of selection. It's where females have certain preferences in males, or males have certain preferences in females, and this gets called sexual selection. It's thought to be, okay, it's a bit different somehow, right? Than just like, evolving to survive. And the classic example is given, although I know there's some technical problems with this example. The classical example that's given is, for example, the peacock's tail. So it's this giant tail. It doesn't help them survive. It actually probably, like hurts them for their survival, like against predators. But the female peahens, what's the actual animal called? I guess peacock is the male, peahen is the female. The peahens, like the peacocks, with a certain kind of tail. You see this in other animal or bird species too. I can't remember what the species is called right now, but there's a type of bird, I think it's black, and it does this dance. So first, like, I think its eye is one color, then it turns yellow, and then it does this kind of dance that's like almost hypnotizing. And like the females look rather like dull, like they're like kind of like a brown camouflage color. The males are this kind of like rich black color with like flashy eyes and stuff like that. And the women seem to like this, right? Okay, so that's sexual.
So can I just sum up just to make sure? So you're talking about there was regular sort of natural selection, whereas like if you don't have this adaptation, you die, and so you're out of the gene pool. And then so that sort of pushes the population in one direction, and the other is that sexual selection, being that one member of one sex will have a trait that the other sex values so much that drives the selection,
right?
And that they're just preferentially mating with
for whatever
reason with those,
And a lot of the times these things, not only are they not related to survival, it's that they sometimes even hurt it, right?
And so it's a lot of like ornamentation and stuff.
Yeah. You can think of that. There could be other things, which we'll get to in a sec. So sexual selection seems to be a bit different, or at least it's a thing that's useful to talk about. That's we think of as a different class. Okay, so you have that sexual selection. So what Geoffrey Miller argues is that sexual selection happens on the human mind also, right? And some of the features that you see with, I think it's been a while since I read the big, I think it was focusing a lot on males, and those are the parts that I remember, but some of the features that you see about male cognition, but human cognition in general. So the way the mind works is a result of sexual selection, right? So why is that important for what I'm saying? Well, one thing you find with like survival selection, right, what they would call natural selection, is that a lot of animals like re-evolve this, right? Like if you look at like certain animals we have now, like, and you look at like animals in the past, like there was like things that were kind of similar to, let's say, rhinoceros, like, but among dinosaurs, and or like we have giraffes, but there were like long neck dinosaurs too. We have like wolves, but in Australia where they have pouched animals, they evolve things like wolves, like the Tasmanian wolf. There was also things like large predatory cats. So I mean that's quite interesting that these things just re-evolve all the time. Like there's this way you can survive, these different ways you can survive in the wilds, and different animals just over like many long periods of time that can like re-evolve and be like creatures that existed before. One thing that's argued about sexual selection is it can take you down a path that's unlikely for any other animal to take, right? And so like if you look at humans, if the mind's truly sexually selected, and it's true that no other animal is likely to take that same kind of sexual selection path, and that's debated, by the way, but if that's true, then it would make humans somewhat unique in their cognition. Okay, so that's any questions on that? Because I have another part that I'm gonna jump to, which is like my theory, but.
Well, I would throw into that Richard Alexander and his students, who have always emphasized the role of human sociality as the driving factor in what becoming distinctly human, and particularly sort of intelligence and all that, have always sort of argued that that Miller was right. But that's just part of a bigger story. Like it's like Miller has given too much emphasis to the sexual selection part of this story, and neglected the natural selection part that has to do with larger social context. And all this stuff creates pressures towards greater intelligence to deal with the complications that arise from living in a situation where other really smart people can be taken advantage of you, right? So just to put that in context for people, that you can think Miller is right in terms of the precise description of the dynamic, but also think he's wrong in terms of the amount of influence to which he attributes that dynamic, right?
Well, if you're attributing it to just like, this is why humans are different than animals, I don't think that's in conflict with the Alexander and his student stuff.
No, I'm saying, but the only thing I'm saying is that I think that, and I'm quite confident that Miller has tried to distinguish his work from that line of reasoning.
Oh, I'm not even getting into that. Like, I don't think it's relevant. Okay,
of course it's relevant. Of course
it's not relevant for what I'm about to say.
Oh, okay, fine. It was obviously relevant to the point we're discussing.
But just to summarize sort of what you said so far, is that Miller's argument is that human intelligence, because it's like so unparalleled in the animal kingdom, that this is the result of sexual selection, in that like nothing else we see really has a tail like a peacock. It's just like kind of this weird one-off we got on Earth.
Yeah.
And can we should probably clarify, because again, this might be a bit too abstract. I mean, his point is that the men who were successfully at wooing women were men that were, literate, could, recite poetry or whatever, could, sing songs, could, do creative, thoughtful things that would win the attractions of women. And his point is that it takes greater intelligence to be able to do these things. So women were not selecting for intelligence necessarily directly. Also, humor should mention too, another thing that women find attractive. The women were selecting traits of these men that required intelligence, and so indirectly intelligence was being selected for. Right.
So Jeffrey Miller gets into a lot of different things in his book and elsewhere. I'm not focusing on all the things that Jeffrey Miller gets into. I'm focusing on one particular thing. Right, it's the runaway sexual selection part. Okay. Just that. Okay.
I just wanted to make sure people understood the argument. Right.
So.
Yeah. So he gets into a lot of different things. I'm not focusing on all that. I just wanted to focus on one particular thing. It's the runaway sexual selection. Because we're kind of like talking and maybe criticizing a bit the whole bits about like, humans are different from the animals because of this. I just wanted to focus on one thing.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah. So one of them is the runaway sexual selection. The reason that's relevant is because with, normal selection, it'd probably make more sense from normal people's point of view is like, this is for survival. This is survival, just survival, right? Like, claws help you, fangs help you, horns help you, arms help you, hands help you. And you have this re-evolving in lots of animals. Whereas sexual selection, you can just get some of these weird preferences by women for like what they like or from females and what they like in males, or what males like in females. And it's just like this preference, and it just gets like exaggerated, like just a lot of times, like over time. And the thought is that it's unlikely you'll see this in any other animal. And if to the degree that the human mind has some of that, there are some aspects of the human minds that are kind of these one-offs that you won't see in other are unlikely to see in other animals. And that could be like, it could be an argument like what makes humans a bit different or different from other animals. So, okay. So there was something I actually wondered. So there's this one guy, I don't know if I heard this from him first or someone else, but there's this one guy named Robin Hanson, and he has this kind of like theory he puts out called the Great Filter. And to make it make sense, because I just said a name and a word, okay, we're on Earth and there's life here, right? And there's a whole bunch of stars we see in the sky, and we have now pretty good equipment that can see actually pretty far in space, and we even have a sense that there's planets around a lot of these stars, right? And some people wondered is where's all the other life? Like where's not just that, like where's all the intelligent life? And if you start kind of digging into this ever, one thing that's a little tough is defining what life is and defining what intelligence is. And usually what happens is you start kind of pulling back from trying to make a generic description, and you start looking at, okay, well, what about life like us and intelligence like us? And okay, so where's all the space aliens like us? Like if you look at like Star Trek, for example, there's like aliens like us, like all over the place, and we don't see that. And we don't, one way, because we're not really traveling a lot in space. one way people do this is like, well, when we look in space with a telescope, how come we don't see anything that we would consider artificial, right? And you could argue like maybe the whole universe is artificial and that there's some aliens like making it look like the way it is. But
is this like Fermi's paradox?
Yeah, this is Fermi's. I was trying just not to use big words that people won't. Well, if I just say Fermi's paradox, a lot of people aren't going to understand.
No, but just in case people are like, this sounds familiar. It's Fermi's paradox.
So where's the aliens? How come when we look up at telescopes, we don't see anything artificial? How come everything looks like everything else we see in space, right? And okay, so where's all the aliens? And Robin Hanson, I don't know if he's the one that came up with it, but he came up with the idea of the great filter. Like maybe there's something out there that's like going and like killing everything, like either killing it if it ever gets intelligence or killing it before it ever gets intelligent, right? And one thought I had is if the human mind is, intelligent like us, because like if you try to define intelligence like really generally, it gets really tough, and you end up like saying, okay, well, this is too much. Let's just pull back. Let's look for intelligence like us. If intelligence, like our types of intelligence, is a result of runaway sexual selection, then that could suggest, because sexual selection is like it'll take you under a certain path that's very improbable that any other animal will take. If it's the case that our intelligence is the result of something that's very improbable, maybe that's why we don't see aliens like us, right? Like there's no aliens out there that have intelligence like us because our type of intelligence is a result of runaway sexual selection. And because it's so improbable that you would ever have this happen, we don't see other aliens like that. Like maybe that's it. It was just a thought I had a long time ago. I think I tweeted it or something. But yeah, that was a theory I had.
So it would be the same, I think you said, of like peacocks looking up and being like, where are all the other peacocks?
Actually, that's pretty much what I tweeted. I think I told you.
No, I know. These are your words, right? It was a good line. And I wanted to.
That was basically what I tweeted, something like that before. It was that a peacock looks up into space and like, where's all the other like animals with peacock tails, right?
Right.
And if it's the result of runaway sexual selection for the peacock tail, and I know there's debate, like maybe it's a costly signal, but if it's really the result of a one-off, very improbable runaway sexual selection, you don't expect to see peacock tails on any animals in space, right? And if the mind is like a peacock tail, or like if it's a result of like a very improbable runaway sexual selection, you won't expect to see other aliens with a mind quite like that, right? And like if you want to define intelligence in that sense, right? Like intelligence like us.
Well, and I think that like.
No,
Sorry, go ahead, Michael. Okay. Fine, I'll go. I was just going to say that I think that it's sort of similar to, like we have this tendency to think of evolution like going towards intelligence, like we're on like an escalator to intelligence, and this is sort of just like the outcome that would happen. But I mean, evolution is directionless. So I think that it very well could be that intelligence is just some relic that happened from some happenstance. But yeah, so I'm just trying to.
Okay, so I'll push back. I don't find this really convincing. So I think that where there's a lot of assumptions in that. Obviously, but assumptions that I'm going to question. So I mean, okay. First of all, I mean, obviously we don't know the answer to this, but I mean, you're aware that, I mean, there are people like Dawkins who speculate, and it seems to make sense that, if there's life on other planets, it probably has to be evolving in some process similar to the way it's evolving here, right? Why? So I mean, maybe because if you just break it down into the chemical processes, right? I mean, these are the biology is built on specific chemical processes, and the chemical processes are built on physical processes. So we have no reason to assume that these processes should be different at other corners of the universe. We expect the same laws of physics to apply. We expect the same chemical processes to exist, right? Yeah. They may not, right?
If you get into like how to define life, it gets really tricky, right? Like some of that is like, okay, life's going to be like similar to us chemically. Is some of it seems like when I've thought about it, it seems to come out of the result of that defining life very generally is really, really tough. And you basically pull back to a position that, okay, we're only going to look at life that's like us, only look at life that's kind of chemical, right? Like, for example, is fire alive? Are crystals alive, right? And then you say, okay, well, we want this information we pass on. Like, okay, well, what if you could do that?
So let's not. Okay, but let's not get okay. I think this is a total tangent, okay, and a bit of a red herring. So I mean, this may be true. I think we're getting hung up on the word life, right? That's not the point. So I'm saying evolve, like, because we're talking about evolutionary processes, right? So where life has come to exist through evolutionary process, there's no evolution involved in fire, right? You know, where evolution has come to exist, it's come to exist. We're talking about, you know, chemical bases of life forms that have evolved into, you know, biological forms, then probably they would have to have followed some kind of similar process. This is probably a principle of the universe, or whatever you want to call it, rather than something that's unique to Earth. But I mean, that may not be true. But let's just, for the sake of argument, assume that that's true, right? Lots of people believe that. It's not less like I'm making this up, right? You know, I mean, a lot of other people, you know, who study this stuff for a living, you know, believe that this is probably true. So
we have an assumption. Fantastic. Go on.
Yeah. So, you know, assuming that's true, then. So if that's the case, then you know, wherever you're finding these life forms, you can debate the inherent merit of a peacock's tail, but I don't think you can debate the inherent merit of intelligence. Right?
Well, hang on.
Let me make my point. You can respond to my point when I made my point, right? Is that intelligence is solving problems, and wherever you are, whatever environment you're dealing with, you're going to have to solve problems. Right? I don't think there's anywhere in the universe you can live where you're not going to be confronted with the unknown, where you're not going to be confronted with, you know, environments of factors in the environment that are hostile to your existence. You know, these sort of things are going to exist, and the better you are at solving whatever problems come up to challenge your existence, you know, in the evolutionary context where we're concerned with fitness, then intelligence is going to be a virtue. So if we're looking for things that are going to be amplified by sexual selection, I think something that would have the inside track, as it were, for a race to what's going to be amplified by sexual selection, it would probably be intelligence over any of the other things that you see. And the fact that we're the only species for which you can make the argument on this planet, I don't think transfers very well to the entire scope of the universe, right? Where there's so many other possibilities. It seems highly unlikely that there wouldn't be sexual selection for intelligence if there are other life forms that are similar to us in terms of how they evolved.
Okay, so one assumption I think that's built into what you're saying is that, and this is going to get into a long debate, that there's a single thing called intelligence, right? And this gets into the whole like IQ debates and what's the general factor in intelligence. I think from a computational point of view, there's not a single thing called intelligence, at least not a useful thing in the way most people think of it, right? Like if you take a computer, for example, and there's different ways of organizing a computer, and one of the common one is I think it's the von Neumann architecture. So it's the one where you have a CPU, you have some memory that's away from it, you have a hard drive, you know, just the classical design you see in a lot of computers. If you just like leave it there, it does nothing, right? You have to put in domain specific things to get it to do anything useful, right? And if you mean by intelligence, like that there's these domain specific problem solvers, right? Okay, so if you have those, that's a separate thing than just evolving for intelligence. Like in that case, you're evolving for these specific kinds of intelligence, right? You see similar type of things when you go in the application of what people might call machine learning or artificial intelligence in real world practice. You don't just like build a generic thing. I build a thing to detect a certain kind of fraud. I build a thing to recognize cats. I build a thing to recognize trees. I build a thing to predict the value of the price of something, you know, 2 days out. I don't have like a generic thing that I build. In that case, okay, so if you say the thing like you would have selection for intelligence, like, okay, but if you look at that closely, there'd probably be selection for specific kinds of intelligence, right? And the argument I was making is that some of the specific kinds of intelligence that humans have, like some of them will be for survival, some of them will be under sexual selection, and those ones that are under sexual selection, if what all the assumptions I said were correct, just like we have assumptions in this case, if all those assumptions are correct, then it's not probable that you would see those sexually selective domain specific ones evolved into aliens.
Okay, so you said that, but I actually don't. What you said doesn't, to me, constitute an argument. Actually, so you listed a whole bunch of different kinds of things that you're calling intelligence, right? But the fact of the matter is, if any one of these serves the function of being better at solving problems and provides a fitness advantage, and if that thing at the same time is something that is appealing to the opposite sex in any way, then it's going to become amplified. And if it's amplified, then you have the potential for this runaway sexual selection. Now, and I think in terms of this whole, quibbling about the interpretation of intelligence, and you're right. I mean, it's too long a discussion for us to go into here. We've been going into this too long. But I mean, I'm just saying, like, you brought up Miller's book, the process that Miller's describing. I don't see any reason why you would not expect that to occur if the intelligence, however we're defining it, if it serves these two purposes. One, it provides this immense fitness advantage, the kind of thing I was talking about in relationship to what happened when hominins entered the cognitive niche. If it has that benefit, and if it also has the virtue of being attractive to the opposite sex, then not only is it not impossible, it's almost for sure that if, across the vast expanse of the universe, if there's any life, evolved life forms out there, that somewhere that's going to be evolved for. I just don't find this. I just don't find it.
So one thing I think you're saying, and I want you to correct me if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying. It sounds like what you're saying is that you could have this runaway sexual selection pushing something to increase somehow in the mind, but then as a side effect of that, you get this kind of general problem solving ability that's built into the mind. Am I characterizing what you say accurately, or no?
Well, I mean, kind of, right? I mean, like, this is where I would have to go back to my own thing, and maybe we're going on too long. But I mean, like, the problem solving ability and the ability to woo the opposite sex are kind of, they're kind of similar, and I don't know if they're the same thing or not, but they're similar type processes. But to me, they're both manipulating symbolic signifiers in some way. But the ability to be able to solve problems, if we can just use a simple definition for the sake of this discussion, use a simple definition of intelligence to say intelligence is the ability, and some people do use this as the definition, by the way. Intelligence is the ability to be able to respond flexibly to find solutions to novel problems, right? So if you think of intelligence in terms of that way, so it's not the sort of evolved module that evolutionary psychologists are talking about, is that you just have this reality. You don't think about running away from snakes. You just have this immediate response when you see a slithering in the grass to jump out of the way, right? That's not intelligence, right? So there's all kinds of things like that to get you to just do smart things. But intelligence, we'd say, that is this ability to sort of improvise in relation to novel challenges to solve problems, right? So but that ability then also gives you the ability to be able to do things that are novel and interesting to get the interest of the opposite sex. So these things, not exactly the same thing, but they kind of draw upon the same sort of capacity. Right. So I'm saying, if you've got those two things, or one thing, or whatever, however you want to argue it, right? Wherever you got life that's, chemical based life that's going through evolutionary processes, there's going to be a privileged role for this compared to, bright plumage or, whatever other kinds of things have been emphasized in sexual selection in other species. I just think that it's almost inevitable. It's like the argument, what's his name? The guy who wrote the Making of the Fittest, I can't remember his name now. Anyways, I mean, he makes this point that, that contrary to someone like Stephen Gould, who always argued that, well, evolution is totally random, and if you rewind the tape recorder, it will play something different. But he demonstrates that it's not true, that, there's certain kind of pathways that evolution follows. And I think you actually were making this point earlier around natural selection. There are certain pathways, certain kinds of problems, certain solutions to problems in evolutionary terms are repeated over and over again across different species, and even across different I can't think of the larger categories, different phenotypes or whatever, right? Different kinds of categories of animals. You find the same solutions all the time. And I think this is an example of that, right? It's so valuable to be able to solve, to be able to find flexible solutions to novel problems, that this is going to be beneficial, and therefore it's going to be selected for. And if it turns out to be beneficial for mating, then it's going to be subject to sexual selection, and you have the potential for runaway selection.
Then why is it just humans? Like, why hasn't this evolved more times?
Well, who says it's not, right? I mean, like, we'll see, right? I mean, like, we're the first ones here, right? It doesn't mean it's not going to happen again, right? Someone's the first. It's like we're having a race, right? And the first person crosses the finish line and says, well, why can't everyone else cross the finish line, right? I mean, everyone's coming, right? But no one else has crossed the finish line.
I guess I'm just not sure that it's like it all like is on such a trajectory. Like that kind of just goes against. I have to think it through, but I feel like that goes against almost everything that I was taught about evolution, that it was just like what strategy happens to work in a certain environment at any time, and that can take you in any direction.
I'm not actually trying to contradict that, but I'm saying that certain things are more beneficial. Intelligence is more valuable to your fitness in terms of the kinds of things that you can do to take care of your needs, to survive or to mate or whatever, as than just having a beautiful tail, right? A beautiful tail is great for one thing if you're a peacock, right? But that's the only thing you can do if it is get a mate. I'm not saying it's not valuable, obviously it is. But if you're, once the hominin enters the cognitive niche, then you can build farms, and you can, build airplanes, and you can do, you can travel all around the world in ships. And I'm like, just there's so many things all of a sudden you can do that provides benefit that you just don't get from having a beautiful tail.
Keep in mind that when I was talking, I wasn't talking about a general ability to solve problems. I was talking about like a domain specific thing that was part of the human minds that human females might be interested in and might, through sexual selection, exaggerate.
Yeah, but you did, Grant. You did build out of Miller, and I think Miller's case
correct.
was.
I also said I was picking a very specific thing that Miller was talking about, not all of his things. Like he talked about many, many, many different things, and I was just trying to focus on the runaway sexual selection part. And you're right.
But the runaway selection part is, I mean, the reason for what's being selected and the reason it's being selected are kind of central to his argument, right?
Right. Okay. So there are some parts that could help you outside of like just sex, right? There's also sexual selection to the degree that the theory is correct, that you can have stuff selected for that doesn't help you with your fitness, and could even it could be like unrelated, or it can be something that actually hinders your fitness. And I'm not talking about the costly signal stuff. So that's a separate topic. I don't really want to get into right now because it's long. But if there's the case that you can have stuff that's either unrelated to your fitness or even harms it a bit, and that gets sexually selected, and that's part of the mind. And if it's correct that these tend to be like one-offs, it's so improbable that you go under this path that you're likely to see it happen again. So if human mind contains that, and if you define the human mind being whatever it is plus that, right, and that other thing that's improbable is necessary for it, then you're unlikely to see that in like animal or in aliens, for example.
So let me just give one sort of addendum to Charles' position. Here's what I think would be a more convincing argument, right? Is that if once the sexual selection selects for high intelligence, you get a super high intelligence, and you get this species that becomes something like us and can do all these crazy things that I mentioned earlier, from figuring out farming.
What does it mean to be of high intelligence? Like, what does that mean?
I've already told you what I mean. I've already told you. I'm not going to tell you again. But my point is that among the other things that you can do when this species becomes so intelligent, it can also build things like nuclear weapons, right? And so it may well be that the end result of being a hyper intelligent species is that you end up annihilating yourself and sending yourself into extinction. So maybe every other time that that we've had the sexual selection runaway of high intelligence anywhere else on the planet, they got to the point where they became so sophisticated in their manipulation of the natural world that they eventually just destroyed themselves, and that's why none of them exist anymore. That I would find to be a more convincing example of why you're not finding them out there. They probably just all destroyed themselves.
Sure. I question whether there's a generic kind of like intelligence.
Yeah, and I feel like we probably should wrap this up soon, but because it was Charles's pet theory, I feel like we should let him have the last word on it. And anything you wanted to add just to sort of wrap it up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like talking about like, just an animal having like great intelligence, I question whether there's like a generic intelligence. I mean, you can argue like, for example, like maybe a computer or something like that, but a computer doesn't do like fuck all unless it like has, sorry, it doesn't do unless you like actually.
See, I gave a child warning earlier when I was talking about the cannibals.
We're gonna keep it classy. We're gonna keep it classy.
So a computer doesn't do anything unless you give it programs, right? But even like the computers we have. Hang on a second. Even the computers we have.
Michael, he's getting the last word. He's getting the last word.
Even the computers we have are not these generic things. I mean, we made specific architecture choices, and you can rearrange computers in lots of different ways. I know what IQ is. I know what general intelligence is. I know of the different interpretations of it, but I don't think the interpretations that there's this generic intelligence people have, like in any useful definition of the word intelligence. I'm not talking about like processing speed or anything like that, or nerve conductivity speed. In any useful definition of intelligence, I don't think there's in general like a just generic type of intelligence. And I don't think you can select, and because I don't think it exists, or at least I'm not convinced it exists. I don't think you can select for a generic type of intelligence. So that's my final word.
All right. Thank you.
I really can't say anything else.
You're not allowed to say anything else. We can talk about it again in another episode, but I think out of courtesy to everyone, he gets the last word.
All right. This has been a long episode. This has been a long episode.
A really long episode. Okay. So I want to thank you guys for going along with my idea of all talking about our favorite theories, what makes human human. That being said, I'm going to go downstairs and cook myself some lunch. I'm starving. But it was fun, and we'll be back again next week.
Okay, bye. See you later. Bye, Charles. Bye, Patricia.
Bye.
See you.